This video is for all the people interested in getting started in web development. I put this together with a focus on doing a project at the end, but with this video I want to solve a couple of problems that I see with a lot of tutorials. You may have heard the term, if you've looked at a few videos already, of tutorial hell, right? This is the result of a lot of tutorials. What they do is basically the Bob Ross approach to teaching things, right? They're gonna show you how to do it, and it's kind of like a follow along sort of thing. Like we have an end goal in mind. They're gonna go through step by step the proper way to set the thing up, and the idea is that you follow along. This is a way to learn some things, but more than anything, what you're actually gaining through doing that is muscle memory. If you study the literature on neurology and education and actually how to learn and understand, this doesn't work. This will leave people with a lot of projects, which it's good to have projects, but not a lot of understanding. And I've been doing this work for about 2 years now, almost 3 years, teaching people full stack web development. And comprehension is absolutely one of the things that people struggle with a lot. So what I want to accomplish here, we're going to go through the very basics. We're going to start with just a simple HTML and CSS project. It's going to be, by the end, my goal is to have you being able to make a business card. And somebody might say, well, what's the point of that? This is online. Like, business cards are useless, and I don't need a business card. I don't ever have one. The reason I chose this is because it's a really nice, small encapsulation of probably 80% of the things that you're going to first learn with HTML and CSS. It's small enough that it can be done well. Your output can be quite nice, actually, and it's really accessible. It's something that anybody can do. We're going to use CodePen.io, so everybody has access to it. You don't need to install any programs on your computer, but it's also something that you have some play with. You have some wiggle room, and it actually encapsulates some design principles that are really important. One of the things that I ran into, and I think is probably common, especially for a more technical or technically oriented person, a logical person, design and logic don't necessarily always go hand in hand. But if you skip over the design principles, if you skip over, a lot of boot camps will skip over CSS, you miss out on the one thing that's going to make the first impression on everybody. So whether you want to do this for yourself or starting a business or trying to get a job, overlooking the importance of design is going to work against you every time, because the first thing that people are going to see is the visual. So how this video is going to break down: first, basics of HTML. How do we set up a document, get it loaded into the browser? Then we're going to go into CSS, talk about how CSS works, what it does. We're going to look at some things in CSS regarding font, layout, and what's called Flexbox. And then by the end, you should be able to run off. You can play with it. You don't have to do the project that I'm giving at the end, but I think it's a good place to start. And one of the things I forgot to mention, the reason I picked a business card as well is because all the design principles apply. Basically, websites, if you think about them, are trying to accomplish the same thing as your average ad, a storefront, and a business card. It's trying to show information in an intuitive way so that your eyes are drawn to the pieces that they need to be drawn to. Quite frankly, business cards are roughly the same thing as a hero header, more or less. Like, what you're going to see at the top of a website is generally going to be roughly the same as what you're going to see on somebody's business card. So that's another reason that I chose this as a mini project, is because basically from here, you just blow everything up. You know, it's just a small version of the things that you're generally going to replicate over and over and over again when you're doing web design. So with that out of the way, let's get set up with an HTML document. Now, I'm just going to use Notepad for this. You can, if you want to try this, you can use any text editor you want. It really doesn't matter. All that you need to be able to do is save it on your system as a .html thing. So let's talk about the basic unit of an HTML file known as tags. What a tag basically is it's telling the browser, and for the record, the browser is doing all the heavy lifting when it comes to the internet. Mostly what HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files are is just the instruction set. One way to think about it is HTML is like a pile of Lego blocks, and CSS is basically the instructions about how and where to put them. So every tag is surrounded by chevrons. They're the greater than and less than symbols. A lot of people will call them corner brackets. But you have two for the what's called opening tag and two for the closing tag. The difference between them is the closing tag, whatever the thing is, whether it's HTML or a link or an image or whatever have you, the closing tag has a slash inside of it. But just remember that most tags are comprised of an opening and a closing. And if you think about it like there's two beams that shoot out from the opening and closing tags, and then that creates a box around everything else that's inside of that object. And they can be next to each other or inside of each other. There's a lot of relationships that HTML elements will have. And we don't need to get too much into that just yet. But just think of it this way. Corner brackets, opening, corner brackets with a slash inside of it, closing, and then each tag will have its own name. And we'll get into that in a second. There are some tags that don't have an opening and a closing. They'll be called self-closing or empty tags. And funny enough, in order to set up an HTML document, we're actually starting with an empty tag or a self-closing tag called doctype. And doctype is just telling the browser where to begin. It's basically saying, hey, what you're about to read is an HTML document. So interpret what you see here with that in mind. And so from there, we start with the first opening and closing pair of tags. We have HTML. Everything that is going to be on the web page needs to be enclosed inside the HTML box, if you will. And HTML breaks up into two basic components, a head and a body. The simple way to think about it is the body is everything that you see on the web page. It's the facade, the superficial, the physical output. The head is everything that you don't see but that the browser might need, or that, for instance, Google's going to look up. It's your metadata. Basically the same way you have tags on a YouTube video, the head of the HTML document is going to store the data that might be technically important but isn't necessarily important to the end user. And just to give you an example of this, one tag we can use is called title. So this goes in the head, and what this does is it actually tells the browser the name. So as right now you can see we have example.html is in the title bar. We just simply change this to example now. You can see it changes that to example. And now for a very basic and fundamental tag, when you're putting text on the page, it's going to be what's called a p tag or a paragraph. And we'll just put a hello there in this. I'm starting a campaign to replace hello world with hello there because Star Wars, why not? And now you can see hello there appears on the screen. Another tag we can use, just very simple. It's still text, but it tells us something important actually. We use H1, and H stands for header. And you can have everything from an H1 to an H6. There's a hierarchy to these. H1 is going to ultimately be the most important thing on the web page. When Google's looking at your page, it's going to actually consider things in a hierarchy in terms of information. H1 tells Google, this is what this web page is all about. So if somebody searches for the thing that's actually in your H1 tag, that's going to really help with search ranking. So with that in place, and you can kind of get an idea of just how simple this stuff can be, let's go ahead over to CodePen. We'll get you set up over there, and we'll take a look at our first CSS. This is the CodePen homepage. I strongly recommend that you sign up and create a username so you can save all of your stuff here. But for the purposes of this part of our video, I'm just going to jump in so you can see it in action. And personally, I prefer to have these things docked to the left so I get at least a relatively normal sized screen over here. Now, what I'll do, just since we're doing the example here, I'm just going to copy the HTML that I just made. One thing about CodePen, this is automatically assuming everything is in the body. So we don't need to do all of the external HTML. We can just go straight into making the things that are going to be on the web page, which is one of the reasons that it's convenient. Another reason, the CSS is automatically applied. In a future tutorial, I will show how to link CSS to HTML when you're doing things manually. But for this, this is one of the reasons I want to use CodePen. It simplifies things. So I like simple. CSS. What is CSS? As I said, it's the rules for how things are supposed to look. There are several what are called selectors, or ways we can point to things in the HTML document to tell the browser what we're trying to alter. The first one is actually direct by the tag. So we can actually select the HTML, we can select the body element, and we can select, the H1. These are the tags and the P. So what's important to notice here is it's literally just the name of the thing. We just type HTML, we just type body, just H1, P, what have you. And then you'll see the curly brackets afterwards. So this is the standard syntax or the way that you write a CSS rule. The first thing is, what am I targeting? So that's the HTML, the body, the H1, the P, and we'll go with the P. The second thing, open and close curly brackets. This is basically the same thing as the tags, where you have the corner brackets at the beginning of the P, and then the /P for the end tag, right? So in CSS, the curly brackets, open and close, tell them, one is the start of the set of rules for a P tag, and the second one is the end of the set of rules. So everything inside of here is what it's going to do to whatever tag or whatever thing you have selected by the CSS. So to give you an idea, and we'll start working with some basics here. So the most basic thing is color. Color actually targets the color of the object, the line, if you will, or the fill. So if we change this to blue, for instance, you can see the hello there changes to blue, which is a little bit hard to read. So let's hop over to the H1. We'll change the color to blue as well. There you can see blue. Maybe cyan will be more obvious. Nice and bright and terrible. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so this is easier to see. Very, very important detail here. First thing when you're creating a CSS rule, what's the thing that you want to change? Then you put a colon, and then you put the thing you want to change it to. So we want to change the color to cyan. Every single line in a CSS, every single rule needs a semicolon at the end of it. If you don't put the semicolon, the CSS will break, and the later rules will not get applied. Unfortunately, I won't be able to show you this on CodePen because they have some things working behind the scenes to prevent these errors. But if you're working on a code base in a proper IDE and you miss a semicolon, the entire thing's going to break. So don't forget those. And keep that in the back of your mind. I would actually encourage you to take some notes so you can have things for later. And this is one of those notes to take. Important note. Missing semicolons will lead to a lot of CSS not working. So if you ever have a web page and it's like none of your CSS is loading, check that. So in addition to color, we're going to go through some more styling basics here, but let's make a couple of elements so I can show a lot of hello there's, but also give an idea of how this is going to work. So we can get rid of the HTML and body for now. And let's put this color back to black for now, just so it's not such an eyesore. Now, you will notice that we only have one CSS rule applying to P, and every single one of these hello there's is blue. So that's one of the things to know about CSS. It's going to select everything where your rule applies. So now what if we have exceptions? There are different ways that we can go about actually getting elements on the web page. There are two important concepts to understand in order to actually use some of these. So one is attributes. In HTML, inside of the opening tag, you can have things such as ID equals something or class equals something. ID and class are just a couple of many options for what's called attributes. They create unique selectors. The difference between them, IDs are a one-time thing. Only one element on the page should have any given ID. Once you've applied it to an element, every other element that has an ID needs its own ID name. Classes, on the other hand, create rules that we can duplicate over and over and over again onto multiple objects. Basically, think about it like this. An ID is when you want to target one specific thing. Class is when you want to reuse rules on multiple objects, and I'll show you an example of this. So we can name this first hello, and the class we can name, let's say, green. And what we'll do is we'll copy this class so you can see this for firsthand. We can put it right in here. But if we put an ID in here, it needs to be something that's not first hello. And what we can even do is we can go into the H1 and add the green class. And now in our rules, in order to use IDs, you start with hashtag and then whatever the name of it is. Now we've created a block for the ID first hello. Classes start with a dot. And I know this is a bit much, but basically think about it like this. If you're targeting a tag, just write the tag out. Just the name of the tag. That's it, and it will get every tag on the page that matches it. If you want to target a single thing with an ID, so ID equals first hello, if you want to apply a rule to multiple elements on the web page, you would give those elements a class and then target that class or create the rules for that class in CSS by .green. Now everything that has the green class, in this case, we can give it a color of green. And now you'll see everything that has that class changes to the color green. Except if we go into here to first hello, and let's say we change the color of first hello to black, that will override it. So now we have this element is black, the other two are green. Why is that? Without getting too far into the weeds, this is something called specificity, and you don't need to know too much about this right now. You can research this if you want to. It's definitely useful, and you definitely need to know it eventually. But the simple version is the more specific your CSS rule is, the higher priority it has. And IDs are very, very high priority because there's only one thing on there that's going to have that ID. So when the browser is looking at the difference between a class and an ID, it's like everything in the class gets this, everything in a tag gets this. This ID is obviously very important because it's targeting one single thing. So it's going to override class and tag selection. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, really quickly, I'm going to go through some of the things you can do with fonts, and then we're going to look at some of the other colors, schemas, things we can do. First, let's put in a body tag, and we're going to look at something called font family. This is basically what you would think of as font, but the word font in CSS and HTML is just used to mean everything having to do with the text. But font family is how we actually change the text style. So by default, it's a Times type of thing, but we can change this to a sans serif font, and because it's targeting the body, everything inside the body is receiving the same rule. If we were to take this out of here and instead place it just in the P tags, now you would see the text changes for the P tags, but not the header. I'll leave a link down below for some more details on font family because I really don't want to get too hung up on this. This website here has some really cool information for you to go through, and you can kind of see. So what they're showing here on the left is first choice, fallback choice, right? Just in case the browser doesn't have the font that you're looking for, like Arial, it's going to fall back to sans serif. And this is actually showing you, so this is what the browser interprets. This is what it should look like if the first choice is working. And so if we scroll down here a little bit, you can see the avant-garde should look like this. My browser doesn't have that font style, so it just falls back to the sans serif. And it's got a bunch of different examples for the different types of font styles you can see here. So this website is super useful if you're looking for something and trying to see, what is default installed. Right at the top here, I'll point out, you should end the list with a generic font, of which there are 5. Serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. What this is basically saying, these are the 5 you can count on any browser having. Beyond that, there's no knowing what somebody's got installed. That's font family. So let's talk about a couple of the things that we can do with fonts. One is font weight. So we can see here, this is basically your boldness value. I think 400 is the default. If we look at first hello, it doesn't change, right? So it's in hundreds, and you can see this on the web page I was just talking about too. I think 600 is the first bold value. There we go. And it goes all the way up to 900, but I think this font style will probably cap at 6. No, there we go. Okay. So font weight is how you decide bold or normal. And actually, you can even type in bold or bolder if you don't want to use the numbers. The other useful one is text align, and you know this one, even if you don't realize you know this one. So right now everything is kind of aligned left, but if we change this to center, we can see it goes to the center of the page. And this is the same thing as you would normally see in like a Google Doc. The typical values are left, center, right, and justify. And this is the same thing as if you had a Google Doc or a Word document. It's, you know, the align is the same thing as text align in your CSS. So this is left aligned, this is center aligned, this is right aligned. Justify is the fourth common value. It's not really obvious what it's doing here, but if we put in some fake text, I'll show you. Justify is the one that stretches it out across the entire area as opposed to left aligned. And for the last thing we'll talk about when it comes to font, I've set this slightly more complicated CodePen up so that you can really see this and I can really ram some of these ideas home. There's a couple of different ways to do font sizes in CSS, a couple of different values we can apply. So I want to go over them really quickly and I can show you with I think a good example, how they work. So the obvious one that everybody would know is pixels. And for this, what I've set up is I'm starting off with the HTML at 16 pixels. Okay, so that's the base value size. And that would be these ones right over here. Okay. Now I've set these up with two different classes. You'll see the first box, and you can ignore div for now. We'll get into that in a little bit. Over here, though, what I've done is we have these texts are using something called EM. And you can see that EM text. These ones on the right side, that's the second div over here, this is using rem text, REM. And in the class selectors, you can see EM text and rem text. The values just have one little change at the end. So font size is 1.4 EM for the EM text, and font size is 1.4 REM for the rem text. And yet, these are different sizes. These are all the same size. Why is that? What EM means is basically relative to the inherited value. And right now, the inherited value is 16 pixels. 1.4 EM means it's going to be 1.4 times the size of the inherited value. And because of the way that I've formatted this, so you can see that here we have this div, there's a P inside of it, and then this div, there's a P inside of that. Because these are nested, the div has the class, right? Just think of div as a box, it's a container. Because the P is inside this first one, it gets bumped up 1.4, and you can see better is larger. And then this next one is also inside of that, so we start with 16 pixels, we get bumped up to 1.4 times that, and then this one gets bumped up to 1.4 times that value. And it is, the more it nests, the more EM will keep on going up. REM is root relative value. So it's 1.4 times 16 pixels. And no matter how much nesting you do, it's always going to go back to the original root value. An important note with this one, if you use this one, and you can ignore these, you can just do pixels, is fine, but these are useful to know. It's going to be based on the HTML font size and not the body font size. And I'll give you an example. So if we go in here and we change the body font size to 20 pixels, you'll see the relative ones change, but the REM, the root EM values, did not change. The right box will change when I go into the HTML side of the CSS and change that to 20 pixels. Cool. So with div now kind of introduced, that segues us into the concept of the box model. You saw the box that was around the text on that page, right? So let's explore that a little bit and talk about like what exactly is the box model? Why is it important? So on CodePen, you can do this on any website actually. We'll just right click and we'll go to inspect. This is on Chrome. And now on the right side, it'll actually show you how the browser views the web page. And because I clicked on the hello there, it automatically highlights the P tag. If I wanted to select something else on the HTML over here, I can go to this little selector with the box with the arrow inside of it and click on any other thing, and we will do that. And before I do that, I want you to see here. There's the blue, then there's the salmon pink around it, right? That's what we're going to be looking at and working with here. So we can actually hover over things and it'll highlight it. This looks terrible though because of the iframe. But if we go down to the CSS section, the bottom half is actually the styles. You can see this little figure down here. This is a visualization of what's called the box model. The box model breaks down roughly this way. The blue box in the middle is content. The green box around it is padding. The yellow box around that is border. And the orange box around that is margin. Content, padding, border, margin. Okay? And like I said, you can see this on any web page, on any browser. You can look at this sort of thing, kind of, get some practice in. But what we will do, so we can visualize this. First, content is, right now it's the text. The hello there is the content. But we can actually change this to height and width. These are two things that will affect layout. And we'll just do it directly. Let's say 20 pixels height. Well, actually, that didn't really change much. Let's make it 30 pixels. There we go. You can see how the hello there's kind of got moved down a little bit. And width, right now the width is actually the full size of the screen. So we'll leave that way for now. What I want you to be able to see though, let's put the border around this. So border is another CSS thing we can do, and it takes three properties. First, color, so the color of the border. Thickness, let's make it an even 5 pixels. And the style, so right now we'll make it solid so you can see what that looks like. That border is the next layer around content, remember. So we can actually, if we make this 10 pixels, you can see now there's a 10 pixel border. The content's in the middle and it includes the text. And now, this is why I wanted to wait with the width. You can see if we add width in here, and let's say 100 pixels, the border will shrink to 100 pixels across. Let's just make that 200, and we'll change the height to 50 pixels. And what we'll do, so this is a little bit easier to visualize, we'll make the border dashed. And let's change it to say, let's change it to blue. Why not? So it's not so bold. So the last one, if you remember, was, the last two would be padding and margin. So right now, we have a height and a width. You'll notice that the text is up in the left-hand corner here. Padding would actually change that. Padding is the next layer outside of content, if you remember. So we'll do, let's say, 10 pixels, and that will add 10 pixels around the content box. Okay, and I'll be able to show you this in a minute. So if we were to get rid of height, I'll just comment this out for now. You can see now the content height goes back down to the text. And if I change the padding up to, let's say, 20 pixels, now it creates a 20 pixel gap all the way around the text. So finally, margin. If we're considering the way that box model laid out, content's the main piece, padding's the gap around that, the border is the actual physical border around that. We can have it visible or not visible. That is up to you. Finally, what do you think margin will do? Margin will be the gap around the outside of the border the way that padding is the gap around the outside of the content. And yeah, it didn't do much. Let's change it to 50 pixels so you can really see it. So now, if we go back to the inspector, we can view this again. So we come down here, content. You see how it's just the text if we hover over the box in the bottom right corner. Padding, green box around that. Pixel perfect. Border is the yellow box around that, or the blue dashed box that we can now drawing and we can see it. And finally margin, the orange box all the way around that. Cool. And that's the box model in a nutshell. Let's do a couple more things that we can mess around, and then I'll show you one of the most powerful CSS tools I'm going to give you in this video. So real quick, one of the things that's worth knowing is we can set things like width in pixels. We can set it in, let's do 20%, and that's percent of whatever the object it's inside of. So if we do 50%, you'll see it's about 50% the width of the web page. You know, and the margin is eating up some of that, so it's a little bit misleading. We can also do it in inches, funny enough. Let's try 2 inches. Okay, so those are the different types of sizes that we can use. And finally, one I accidentally glossed over here is background color. So background color we can set to, say, salmon, in case you thought I made up that word for colors, or let's say lime green. Trust me, you don't ever want to design pages this way, but this is just for the purpose of the example. So, and background color is going to be one of the useful things. So for instance, we can change this to white, and let's put our border back down to something reasonable. Let's say 2 pixels solid, and we'll make it gray. Maybe that's a less bold thing to have there. That's nice. And then what we'll do on the body, you can see why I did this in a second. We'll make the background color, just for the purpose of the example, I'll use hashtag colors. You don't have to get too caught up in this now. For the background color, we'll make it a light gray. So now you can see the background of everything is this gray color, but inside of our first hello to the border, so the content, the width, and the height is white. So I realize I've thrown a lot at you so far, but we are on the home stretch. However, this is probably the most powerful part. We're going to go into Flexbox. So the reason the box model was important is because this deals with layout. So we understand now things like padding, we understand height and width, margin. This will move things relative to each other. But what if we want to do some slightly fancier, more advanced layout functions? That's where Flexbox comes in. So here's another CodePen. You can ignore some of the CSS in here. I've done strictly for the purposes of demonstration and to show you what these different functions are doing. So what is Flexbox? Basically, think about Flexbox as if you took all of your elements in a given group and you ran a string through everything. Flexbox is going to decide how those things interact with each other along that line. So what I've set up with this one, first, everything is inside a main container. And actually, you know what we'll do? So here's what we're looking at with this. I've set up a sequence of boxes, and they're literally called box in their CSS class, inside of a container class. Now, the boxes have a default height, width, and margin. That's why they're spaced out from each other. And then for some of these, I've put a style attribute directly on them, which is basically creating a local CSS rule set on that specific item, and it's always going to override any other CSS rules. When it comes, I was talking about specificity earlier, that's as specific as it gets. It's like manually setting these things. So, and I did that specifically so you could see the difference between a taller box, the normal boxes, you know, like, so there's some different sizes because some of the Flexbox rules won't be terribly intuitive without that. If we go into the container here, the way that we initiate using Flexbox is a CSS rule called display, and we set that to flex. Now, under normal circumstances, these items would actually be vertically aligned. HTML just puts everything underneath each other. The reason that they are side to side already is because I have applied display flex. This is how we initiate Flexbox on an object. So if we remove this from the div here, you can see this is what HTML is going to be doing by default. If we go into the container, so I applied it to every div, but we can just do it inside the container. If we display is the rule, and flex tells it, okay, we want everything along the line. So right now, we have Flexbox as a row. Now, Flexbox has a series of other CSS values that we can assign. And I'm going to go through them somewhat quickly. If you want to get some more practice in with this, if you want to see it in action and have a fun way to learn about Flexbox, there's a game online called Flexbox Froggy, which I'll link in the description. But for our purposes, here's some of the simple ones. So by default, the orientation is row, but we can change this by saying flex direction column. And now you can see it goes back to basically what it was before, but we'll set it to the default for now so we can see how this works. The two important values that we can manipulate with Flexbox are called justify content and align items. And one goes parallel with the line that the Flexbox creates. The other runs perpendicular. And what I've done to help me set up a visualization for that is I've created this guideline class. So we'll go in here to the container and we'll add guideline. You don't have to give too much thought to all this. This is fancy stuff, but basically I did it so that I can have this dotted line so you can see. This is the middle point of the container div, okay? So as of right now, everything's just kind of starting based on whatever its own padding and margins are, right? And they're all over the place. Align items will alter the orientation of the elements inside of our container perpendicular to this line. So let's try a couple of different ones. So if we say align items, let's start with center. You'll see every single item now, its center matches the center of its parent. We can do, let's say, start. And that actually matches to the beginning of the Flexbox. If we go end, it will be to the bottom of the Flexbox. And there's a third one called baseline that looks like it's doing the same thing as end, but if we were to alter the container to be much larger, you can see what it's actually doing is it's lining up all of the items at the base of the largest item. Right? So it's this one here is becoming the baseline of everything, and the center still remains here. And just so you can see this, so if we do end now, everything goes back to the bottom, and if we do center, everything lines up with our green line. So that is align items. Now, the other one is justify content. Justify content changes the orientation of these things with each other in relation to along the string that's going through them, along the line. The values for this are going to be a little bit hard to visualize just because of the way this thing is laid out. So one of the things we need to do real quick is we'll change the width of this item to, let's say, 100%. Will that give us all the way across? Yeah. So now you can see the boxes are kind of just sitting to the left. So let's say we justify content. That it would be same thing as with align items start. We can align items end. I'm sorry, justify content end, so that moves them all to the last space available. And then center is obviously centering the group. And now here's some of the most powerful ones. We can do space between. And that spaces them out. So let's change the width here just real quick so you can see it. So the margins are actually giving us a little gap on the sides, but what should happen is there's just an equal amount of space between each box. And then if we shift this to space around, normally this would actually give you a half space on the outsides and then even space in between. But again, the margins are throwing it off a little. And so clarifying one last thing here. Let's change the the flex direction to column so we can visualize that. And real quick, let me just fix this line here. So if we change that line to now be going vertical through the center of our object here, you can see line items center, everything is centered. If we do what we did before, baseline, it goes by the base of the largest item. We can do end and so on. We'll keep this center though because that's the most likely one to be used. If we change our justify content now, keep in mind this is parallel to the direction of our flex box. So in this case now that we have flex direction column, it's working on the vertical column. So the justify content, we can say space between, and nothing happens because our height does not accommodate all of the items. Let's change this to 800 pixels. Yeah, the boxes are a little bit messed up, so let's get rid of the styling here real quick because we don't need this for visualizing this flex box rules. So if we make them all similar boxes, we can now see the space between rule taking place, or we can justify them again to center, and it will put all the gaps on the outside and just put them all right next to each other, so on and so forth. Hopefully you get the idea. Column, justify, space between along the column. In a row, justify is space between them along the row direction. I realized that was a lot, but now you have every tool needed to be able to build yourself a business card. I'll throw an example up on the screen here of the project that I put together on CodePen. You may recognize the content of that business card. If you do, let me know in the comments. If you have any questions, also leave them in the comments. I'll answer everybody with as much detail as I possibly can. I'll make shorts if I really need to explain something further. I have no problem doing that. A video will be coming at some point, unlisted, mind you. So it'll be linked in the description for a walkthrough with the project. But please try to just use the rules that we've gone through here. Go back through the video if you need to, take some notes, write down some key points. The best way, absolute best way to use tutorials, and I've tried to make it the way that this tutorial runs so that there's no guesswork really needed. It's just use it the way that it's designed, is get the concepts and try to apply them kind of one at a time. Like work one step at a time through the project. And like I said, the reason that I picked a business card is because the design schema applies all the way across web design. I'll give you a hint. In order to get certain things lined up with each other, what you're going to have to do is put some of the p tags or the header tags into divs and then space the divs from each other. All you need to accomplish this project is header tags, p tags, div tags, flexbox, and the rules that I've shown you here. You can add more flair if you want to, no problem, but you should have everything you need. And if you want a little bit of extra credit, if you're like the overly ambitious type, you can look up box shadow. I will be showing that in the example video once that comes out. So good luck with it. Again, let me know if you have comments, questions. Like I said, I'll put shorts together if anybody has a question and they need more detail. And yeah, hopefully I'll be seeing you guys soon.